Welcome to the deep dive. Looks like you've given us quite the mix of material to go through this time.
You certainly have.
And, well, it's always our mission, of course, to get you the most interesting insights from all of this.
Mhm.
So we're going to look at some pretty different things this time around. Everything from opera and how music is written down
Okay.
to even a look at the role music plays in politics and society.
Right.
All drawn, of course, from the sources that you sent.
I see you've provided us with a really fascinating collection of sources this time. You've got articles on the history of opera and how musical notation evolved, a Yale courses lecture on Gregorian chant and Renaissance music in the Sistine Chapel, a TEDx talk about the role of music in politics in Kenya, a UNESCO page that talks about performing arts as part of our intangible cultural heritage, a history of rock music, and even an article defining jazz.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is. It seems like you're interested in tracing these big, sweeping historical arcs, like the development of opera over centuries, but also looking at the ways music interacts with society in very different contexts. It's a great combination.
Definitely. And that's kind of the mission for this deep dive, right? To help you see these connections and unearth maybe some surprising facts and really memorable details without getting completely overwhelmed by information.
Exactly. We want to give you a concise but thorough understanding of these different topics, how they relate to each other, and why they matter.
So let's start with opera. It's an art form that's been around for, what, over 400 years?
That's right. It originated in Italy during the Renaissance, and it's been captivating audiences ever since.
And it's really more than just singing, right? It's this whole kind of theatrical experience, this combination of music, drama, visual arts, even dance.
Exactly. Opera is all about creating this immersive experience, this fusion of different artistic elements to tell a story in a really dramatic and engaging way.
Now, there was a group, I think they were in Florence, called the Florentine Camerata. And they were kind of like, I don't know, almost like a think tank of artists and writers and musicians back in the Renaissance.
Yes, a sort of Renaissance think tank,
Yeah.
very much focused on reviving the artistic and philosophical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome.
Okay. And they were really fascinated by Greek drama, right?
Absolutely. They believed that the ancient Greeks had achieved this incredibly powerful form of storytelling through their tragedies and comedies, and they wanted to bring that kind of intensity and emotional depth back to the stage.
And that's where Jacopo Peri comes in.
Exactly. Peri was a composer and a member of the Camerata, and he wrote what's generally considered to be the very first opera, Daphne, back in 1597.
So Daphne was like the big bang moment for opera.
In a way, yes. It was the first work to really embody all the key characteristics of opera as we understand it today, the combination of vocal and instrumental music, dramatic storytelling, costumes, sets, and so on. From there, it really took off.
And as opera spread, we saw different styles emerge, like opera seria and opera buffa.
That's right. Opera seria was the grand, stately style of opera that was often performed for royalty and the nobility. It tended to focus on stories from mythology and history, with big, dramatic plots full of gods, emperors, and heroes.
It sounds pretty serious.
It often was. The music was very elaborate, with a lot of emphasis on vocal virtuosity, think big, soaring areas, designed to showcase the power and beauty of the human voice.
And opera buffa was like the opposite of that.
In a way, yes. Opera buffa was all about comedy and satire. It was a much lighter style of opera, dealing with everyday characters and situations, often with a lot of humor and even slapstick.
Like a musical sitcom, almost?
Exactly. Opera buffa poked fun at social conventions and poked fun at the aristocracy. The music tended to be faster paced and more conversational in style, and the stories were often full of misunderstandings, disguises, and romantic entanglements.
So during the Baroque period, which was, from around 1600 to 1750, opera just exploded in popularity, right?
Absolutely. It spread across Europe and became one of the most popular forms of entertainment. These productions became incredibly lavish, with spectacular sets and costumes. Think of it as the Broadway of its day, a really big deal.
Yeah. And they spared no expense.
No, definitely not. The wealthiest members of society would often commission these extravagant operas, and composers were constantly trying to outdo each other with the complexity and brilliance of their music.
They also had these incredible singers called castrati.
That's right. Castrati were male singers who were castrated before puberty to preserve their high-pitched voices. This was a controversial practice, of course, but it produced some truly remarkable singers with extraordinary vocal ranges and power.
And today, of course, those roles are sung by women or by countertenors, men who can sing in a very high register.
Exactly. We've come a long way since the days of the castrati, but their legacy is still very much present in opera. Then, during the classical period, from around 1750 to 1830, we see a shift in style.
So how did opera change during that time?
Well, the Enlightenment was having a major impact on European thought, and that included music and the arts. There was a growing emphasis on reason and logic, and a reaction against what some saw as the excesses of the Baroque era.
So opera became a little more down to earth.
In a way, yes. Composers started writing operas with simpler musical forms, more realistic plots, and a greater focus on emotional truthfulness.
And this is where Mozart comes in.
Exactly. Mozart is considered one of the greatest opera composers of all time, and his works perfectly embody the spirit of the classical era. Operas like The Marriage of Figaro, which you mentioned earlier, are full of wit, charm, and incredibly beautiful music.
I love Figaro. It's so clever and funny, but it also has a lot of heart.
It does. And then you have operas like Don Giovanni, which are much darker and more dramatic. Mozart was a master of both comedy and tragedy, and his ability to create such believable and relatable characters through his music is simply astonishing.
So after Mozart and the classical era, we move into the Romantic period.
That's right, from roughly 1830 to 1900. And this is when opera really became grand in every sense of the word.
What do you mean?
Well, the Romantic era was all about emotion, passion, and individuality. Operas became bigger, louder, and longer, with huge choruses, elaborate sets and costumes, and increasingly dramatic storylines.
A far cry from the simplicity of the classical era.
It was. In Italy, one of the most important trends in opera was the bel canto style, which literally means beautiful singing.
So is bel canto all about showcasing the beauty of the human voice?
Exactly. Composers like Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini wrote operas that were full of soaring melodies, intricate vocal ornamentation, and a focus on pure vocal brilliance.
Rossini was a master of comedy, wasn't he?
He was. The Barber of Seville is one of his most famous and beloved operas, and it's full of witty dialogue, slapstick humor, and of course those unforgettable melodies. But even in his comedic operas, Rossini had a knack for writing incredibly beautiful and moving arias.
And Donizetti wrote Lucia di Lammermoor, right? The opera with the famous mad scene.
That's right. Lucia di Lammermoor is a tragic story of love and betrayal, and the mad scene, where Lucia loses her mind after being forced into a marriage she doesn't want, is one of the most famous and dramatic moments in all of opera.
And of course, we can't forget about Bizet's Carmen, probably the most popular opera of the 19th century. The music is so catchy and memorable, and the story is full of passion and drama. I can't believe it was initially a flop when it premiered.
You're right. It's hard to imagine that now, given its popularity. But you're absolutely correct. Carmen initially shocked audiences with its portrayal of a strong, independent woman who defied social norms. The late 19th century was really dominated by two giants of opera, Verdi and Wagner.
Verdi was Italian, right?
Yes, he was. Verdi was a master of Italian grand opera, and his works are known for their dramatic power, emotional intensity, and incredibly beautiful melodies.
Some of his most famous operas include Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, Aida, and of course La Traviata, the tragic story of Violetta, a courtesan who falls in love with a young man from a wealthy family.
Verdi's music is so deeply moving, and his operas are still performed all over the world today. And then you have Wagner, who was German.
Wagner is a bit of a revolutionary, wasn't he?
He was indeed. Wagner had a very different approach to opera than Verdi. He believed that opera should be a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art that combined music, drama, poetry, visual arts, and stagecraft into a seamless whole.
Wow, that's quite ambitious.
It was. Wagner's operas were often very long and complex, with dense musical textures, intricate plots, and a focus on philosophical and mythological themes.
He was also known for his use of leitmotifs.
That's right. A leitmotif is a recurring musical theme that's associated with a particular character, object, or idea. Wagner used leitmotifs extensively in his operas to create a kind of musical web that connects different elements of the story.
His most famous work is probably The Ring Cycle, which is actually 4 operas performed over 4 nights. It's a massive undertaking, both for the performers and the audience.
It is. The Ring Cycle tells the story of the Norse gods and their struggles for power and love. It's full of symbolism, mythology, and some of the most powerful music ever written for the stage. Wagner's operas had a huge influence on later composers, including Richard Strauss, whose operas Salome and Der Rosenkavalier are considered masterpieces of late Romanticism.
Then, as we move into the early 20th century, we have Puccini, another Italian composer.
Yes, Puccini was a master of melody and drama. And his operas are known for their emotional intensity and often tragic storylines.
He wrote La Bohème, right? The one about the struggling artists in Paris.
That's right. La Bohème is one of the most popular and beloved operas of all time. It's a story of love, loss, and the challenges of pursuing art in a difficult world.
His other famous operas include Tosca, Madama Butterfly, and Turandot. They all feature these incredibly strong female characters who face all sorts of challenges and often meet tragic ends.
Exactly. Puccini's operas really capture the spirit of verismo, a style of opera that emphasized realism and the portrayal of everyday people and their struggles. And then in the mid to late 20th century, we see opera taking on a more overtly political dimension.
Okay, so whose works would you point to as examples of this?
Well, Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district, which premiered in 1934, caused quite a stir with its brutal and sexually explicit content. It actually led to it being denounced by the Soviet government. Then in England, Britain's Peter Grimes, which premiered in 1945, is a searing exploration of social isolation and the persecution of an outsider in a small fishing village. And then in a much more recent example, we have John Adams' Nixon in China, which premiered in 1987. This opera dramatizes President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972 and explores the complex political dynamics of that era.
Wow, so it's pretty clear that opera has been this really dynamic and evolving art form over the centuries.
Absolutely. And through all of these shifts and transformations, opera has remained a powerful means of exploring the human condition, love, loss, betrayal, power, ambition, and everything in between. It's truly a unique and compelling art form. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how we got to the point where we could actually write all this music down.
Right. It's easy to take it for granted, but for centuries, music was just something people played and listened to. There was no way to record it or really study it in the way we can today.
Exactly. So the question becomes, when and how did we develop a system for notating music? The answer, as with many things in Western culture, goes back to the ancient Greeks.
So the ancient Greeks really laid the groundwork for music theory.
They did. Pythagoras, who lived around the 6th century BC, was a philosopher and mathematician who was fascinated by the mathematical relationships he observed in music.
He's the guy who came up with the Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared.
That's the one. But he was also interested in how musical intervals could be expressed mathematically. He and his followers discovered that the lengths of vibrating strings were related to the musical intervals they produced.
Okay, so like a shorter string would produce a higher pitch.
Exactly. And Pythagoras realized that these relationships could be expressed as simple ratios. For example, a string that's half the length of another string will produce a pitch that's an octave higher.
So that was a pretty big discovery.
It was. It showed that music wasn't just this random collection of sounds, but that it was governed by mathematical principles. And this idea would have a profound influence on the development of Western music theory.
Now, it took a while for these ideas to really take hold in Europe.
It did. It wasn't until the 6th century AD that a Roman senator named Boethius wrote a book called The Institutione Musica, The Principles of Music, that introduced Pythagorean ideas about music to medieval Europe.
Okay, so Boethius was kind of like the bridge between ancient Greek music theory and medieval European music.
Exactly. And then, a bit later, we have Pope Gregory I, who we mentioned earlier, in connection with Gregorian chant.
And he was the one who started the Schola Cantorum.
That's right. The Schola Cantorum was the first music school in Europe, and it was dedicated to the preservation and performance of Gregorian chant, the official music of the Roman Catholic Church.
And during this time, music was still mostly learned and passed down by ear, right?
It was. There was no standardized system of notation yet, so singers would have to memorize these long, complex chants and then pass them on to the next generation of singers. Imagine trying to memorize a whole symphony just by listening to it.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It was, and it led to a lot of variations and inconsistencies in the way chants were performed. So there was a growing need for a more reliable system for writing music down.
And the first attempt at this was with something called neumes.
Right. Neumes were these little symbols that were written above the text of chants. They didn't indicate specific pitches, but they showed the general contour of the melody, whether it went up or down or stayed the same.
So it was kind of like a musical shorthand.
It was, but it was still pretty imprecise. And around the year 1000, an Italian music theorist named Guido d'Arezzo came up with a much better system.
And this was the system that eventually led to the musical notation we use today, right?
Exactly. Guido's system was revolutionary. He introduced the 4-line staff, which is the basis for the 5-line staff we use today. He also came up with a system for naming the notes on the staff using the first 6 letters of the Latin alphabet: A, B, C, D, E. F. And he invented solfege, the do-re-mi system that we still use for sight singing.
So Guido's system was a huge step forward in terms of making music notation more precise and standardized.
It was. But there was still one crucial element missing. A way to indicate the duration of notes. That came a bit later, in the 13th century, with Franco of Cologne.
And he came up with symbols for different note lengths, right? Like the ones we use today, whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, and so on.
That's right. And these symbols were further refined in the 14th century by Philippe de Vitry, who introduced a system of mensural notation.
Mensural notation.
Yes. Mensural notation allowed composers to specify the exact rhythmic relationships between different notes. It was a very complex system, but it allowed for much greater rhythmic precision and complexity in music.
So by the 17th century, music notation had become pretty sophisticated.
It had. And as instrumental music grew in popularity, composers started adding more and more information to the score. They added bar lines to divide the music into measures, dynamics to indicate how loud or soft the music should be, tempo markings to indicate the speed, and all sorts of other instructions for the performers.
And then, in the 20th century, we have the emergence of graphic scores.
That's right. Graphic scores are a completely different approach to music notation. They often use symbols, shapes, and colors to represent musical ideas rather than traditional notes and rhythms.
So they're more abstract and open to interpretation?
Exactly. And that's the whole point. Graphic scores often give performers much more freedom to improvise and interpret the music in their own way.
It's fascinating to see how music notation has evolved over the centuries, from those simple neumes to the complex scores we see today, and it makes you wonder what the future of music notation might hold.
It does. Will we continue to refine our current system, or will we come up with entirely new ways to represent musical ideas? Only time will tell.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to a very different but related topic, Gregorian chant.
Okay, so Gregorian chant is the music of the medieval church, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a type of monophonic chant, meaning it's sung with a single melodic line, no harmony.
And it was named after Pope Gregory I.
Right. Though, as the Yale Courses lecture points out, the connection between Pope Gregory and chant is a bit more complicated than we might think.
So he didn't actually compose all those chants?
Probably not. It's more likely that he played a role in standardizing and codifying the chants that were already in use.
So Gregorian chant is really more of a tradition than the work of a single composer?
Exactly. It's a body of chants that developed over centuries, and it represents the musical heart of the medieval church.
And these chants were sung in monasteries and convents, right?
That's right. Monasteries and convents were the centers of religious life in the Middle Ages, and chant was an essential part of their daily routine.
They would sing chants at specific times throughout the day?
Yes, they followed a schedule of services called the canonical hours.
What were those?
Well, there were 8 canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each hour had its own set of chants and prayers, and they were performed at specific times throughout the day, starting before dawn and ending at night.
So it's a pretty structured and disciplined way of life.
It was, and chant was an integral part of that structure. It provided a soundtrack to their daily lives and helped them connect with God. The Benedictine order was one of the most important monastic orders in the Middle Ages, and they played a major role in the development and preservation of Gregorian chant.
And they followed the rule of St. Benedict, right?
They did. The Rule of St. Benedict was a set of guidelines for monastic life that was written by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century.
So how did Benedict envision the ideal monastic life?
Well, he believed that monks should live a life of prayer, work, and study, and he emphasized the importance of obedience, humility, and stability. The Benedictines also placed a high value on hospitality, and they often welcomed travelers and pilgrims into their monasteries.
So it was a pretty multifaceted way of life.
It was, and chant was woven into all aspects of it. Monks would chant while they worked, while they prayed, and even while they ate.
Wow, that's a lot of chanting.
It was. But for them, it wasn't just about making music. Chant was a way of life. It was a way of connecting with God, of finding peace and solace, and of expressing their faith.
And one of the most remarkable figures from the world of Gregorian chant was Hildegard of Bingen.
Absolutely. Hildegard was an extraordinary woman. She was a Benedictine abbess, a composer, a writer, a theologian, a mystic, a healer, and a visionary.
Wow. It sounds like she could do just about anything.
She was truly a remarkable person, and her music is just as remarkable as her life.
What makes her music so special?
Well, it's incredibly expressive and evocative. She used a wider range of melodic and rhythmic ideas than most other chant composers of her time, and her texts are full of vivid imagery and mystical symbolism.
The lecture mentions that Hildegard believes she received her musical inspirations directly from God.
That's right. She claimed to have visions and to hear celestial music, which she would then write down. It's really beautiful and moving stuff.
Now, Gregorian chant might seem like a pretty ancient and obscure form of music, but it actually experienced a resurgence in popularity in the late 20th century.
It did. In 1994, a group of Benedictine monks from the Abbey of Santo Domingo de Silos in Spain released an album called Chant, which became a surprise international bestseller.
Really? Chant was topping the charts.
It was. It sold millions of copies worldwide and even won a Grammy Award. And it sparked a renewed interest in Gregorian chant, not just among religious listeners, but among people from all walks of life.
Why do you think people were so drawn to chant?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. First, chant is incredibly beautiful and calming. It has a timeless quality that transcends cultures and religions. And in our increasingly busy and stressful world, I think a lot of people find solace and peace in listening to these ancient melodies.
Yeah, it's definitely a different kind of listening experience than, say, going to a rock concert.
It is. Chant is more about contemplation and reflection. It's music that you can really lose yourself in.
So from the single melodic line of Gregorian chant, we eventually get to polyphony, music with multiple independent melodic lines.
That's right. And one of the earliest forms of polyphony was organum, which developed in the medieval cathedrals of France.
And this was happening in the Gothic cathedrals, right? With those incredible soaring arches and stained glass windows.
Exactly. And the lecture even draws a connection between the verticality of Gothic architecture and the way organum was constructed musically.
So just as those cathedrals reached towards the heavens, organum also built upwards, adding new melodic lines above a pre-existing chant melody.
Exactly. The original chant melody, called the tenor, was sung in long, sustained notes, while other voices added new melodies above it, creating a kind of musical tapestry.
So it was a pretty gradual process, right?
It was. At first, the added melodies were very simple, just moving in parallel motion with the tenor. But over time, composers started experimenting with more complex and independent melodic lines, creating a richer and more textured sound.
And then we moved to the Renaissance and the Sistine Chapel.
Ah, the Sistine Chapel, one of the most iconic and awe-inspiring spaces in the world. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, it was also the center of musical innovation in the Catholic Church.
What made it so special?
Well, first of all, it was the Pope's private chapel, so he had access to the best musicians in Europe.
And he didn't hesitate to hire them?
No, he didn't. Some of the greatest composers of the Renaissance, like Josquin des Prez and Palestrina, worked in the Sistine Chapel.
And they were composing both chant and polyphony, right?
They were. In fact, Palestrina is often considered the master of Renaissance polyphony. His music is incredibly beautiful and intricate, but it also has a sense of serenity and restraint that reflects the spirit of the Counter-Reformation.
The Counter-Reformation.
Yes. The Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, and one of its aims was to reform church music, to make it more dignified and spiritually uplifting.
Okay, so Palestrina's music was part of that effort.
It was. His music is characterized by clear, balanced vocal lines, a focus on consonant harmonies, and a sense of restraint and elegance. It's a very different sound from the more exuberant and expressive music of the late Renaissance.
The lecture also talks about the Papal Chapel, which was the choir that sang in the Sistine Chapel.
Right. And the Papal Chapel was an all-male ensemble, so they had to come up with creative ways to sing those high soprano parts.
Like using falsettists.
Yes, falsettists are men who can sing in a very high register using a technique called falsetto, and they were an important part of the Papal Chapel.
They also used choir boys.
That's right. Choir boys were often used to sing the soprano parts in church music. They had these beautiful, clear voices that were perfect for the music of the Renaissance.
And then, of course, there were the castrati.
Ah, yes, the castrati. They were male singers who were castrated before puberty to preserve their high voices.
And they were incredibly popular in the 17th and 18th centuries.
They were. They had these powerful androgynous voices that were unlike anything else. And they became the superstars of the opera world. We even have a recording of the last castrato, Alessandro Moreschi, who sang in the Papal Chapel in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The lecture plays a brief excerpt of him singing, though it doesn't sound as impressive as it must have in its time. The recording technology then simply wasn't up to the task.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like to hear these singers live in their prime.
It must have been truly extraordinary. But even without the castrati, the music of the Sistine Chapel is still incredibly powerful and moving. It's a testament to the human spirit and the enduring power of music. Now, let's step outside the world of European classical music and look at the role of music in society, starting with Dr. Holly Everett's lecture on the occupational folk life of musicians in East Texas during World War II.
Okay. So this lecture looks at the Silver Steep in Orange, Texas. It was a red light district that developed during the war, fueled by the influx of workers who came to work in the shipyards.
That's right. And music was a huge part of the Silver Strip. There were all these clubs and honky-tonks that featured live music, and musicians came from all over to play there.
The lecture focuses on the experiences of Cajun musicians who came from Louisiana to work in the shipyards and play music on the Strip.
Exactly. And it was a pretty tough environment. They were often playing for long hours for not much money, and they had to deal with all sorts of shady characters.
There were also these moral tensions in Orange, a town with a strong Baptist presence, where things like drinking and dancing were frowned upon within the city limits.
Right. But the Silver Strip was outside the city limits, so it was a place where people could let loose and have a good time, even if it meant bending the rules a bit.
So music was a way for people to escape the realities of war and the pressures of their jobs.
Exactly. It was a form of entertainment, but it was also a way for people to connect with each other, to build community, and to find a sense of belonging.
The lecture also touches on the role of the USO, which provided a more wholesome form of entertainment for the troops.
That's right. The USO hosted dances and concerts that were alcohol-free and open to both men and women. They were trying to provide a safe and fun environment for the troops while also upholding certain moral standards.
So even in wartime, there were these debates about the role of music and dancing in society.
Absolutely. And those debates continue to this day. Now, let's turn our attention to the UNESCO page on performing arts as intangible cultural heritage.
Okay, so this page talks about how traditional music, dance, and theater are not just forms of entertainment, but they're also expressions of cultural identity and social values.
That's right. And UNESCO recognizes the importance of preserving these traditions for future generations.
The page emphasizes that intangible cultural heritage isn't just about the performances themselves. It's also about the knowledge, skills, and practices that are passed down from one generation to the next.
Exactly. It's about the communities that create and sustain these traditions. And it's about the ways in which these traditions connect us to our past and to our cultural roots.
The page also discusses the challenges of preserving intangible cultural heritage in a globalized world.
Right. Globalization has led to the increased exchange of ideas and cultures, which can be a positive thing. But it can also lead to the homogenization of cultures and the loss of unique traditions. The page notes that recording traditional music using Western notation, while useful for archiving and education, also has the potential to flatten the unique tonal nuances and rhythmic subtleties that characterize many non-Western musical systems. It also emphasizes that music traditions are living, breathing things that evolve over time, and that simply preserving them in a museum-like setting can actually lead to their decline.
So it's about finding a balance between preserving tradition and allowing it to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances.
Exactly, and that's a challenge that many cultures are facing today. Now let's shift gears again and look at Esther Kibori's TEDx talk on the role of music in politics in Kenya.
Okay, so this TEDx talk explores how music has been used in Kenya to promote political messages, to unite people, and even to discourage violence.
That's right. Kibori talks about how music can be a powerful tool for social change. She gives several examples of how music has been used to mobilize communities, to raise awareness of political issues, and to inspire people to action.
One of the examples she gives is the song 2020, which was used during the 2002 elections in Kenya.
That's right. 2020 means 2020 in Swahili, and it became a rallying cry for political change. The song was incredibly popular, and it helped to create a sense of unity and hope among Kenyans who were tired of corruption and political stagnation.
Kiburi also talks about how music can be used to promote peace and reconciliation.
She does. She gives the example of a song called Indi Umuntu, which means I am human, in Kikuyu, one of the main languages spoken in Kenya. This song was written in response to the post-election violence that erupted in Kenya in 2007 and 2008, and is used to promote healing and reconciliation between different ethnic groups.
It's amazing to see how music can be used in such powerful ways.
It is. It shows how music can be more than just entertainment. It can be a force for good in the world. And it can help us to connect with each other on a deeper level. Now, the last two sources you gave us offer a glimpse into the evolution of two very different but influential genres of music, rock and jazz.
Okay, so let's start with rock. It's a genre that's been around for about 70 years now, and it's had a huge impact on popular culture.
It has. Rock music emerged in the 1950s, and it quickly became associated with youth culture, rebellion, and social change. It was a fusion of different genres, including blues, country, and rhythm and blues.
And early rock and roll pioneers like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard were incredibly popular.
They were. They were seen as rebels and rule breakers, and their music challenged the social norms of the time. Rock music continued to evolve in the 1960s with the emergence of the British invasion, led by bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who.
And the British invasion had a huge impact on American music, didn't it?
It did. It brought a new energy and excitement to the rock scene, and it inspired a whole generation of American musicians.
And rock music just kept evolving, right? Splitting off into all sorts of subgenres.
It did. In the 1970s and 80s, we saw the emergence of genres like heavy metal, punk rock, new wave, and alternative rock. And rock continued to evolve in the 1990s and 2000s with the rise of grunge, indie rock, and pop punk. Today, rock music is as diverse as ever, and it continues to be a major force in popular culture. Now, jazz is another uniquely American music genre, with roots in New Orleans in the early 20th century.
And jazz is all about improvisation, right?
It is. Jazz musicians often start with a basic melody or chord progression, and then they improvise around it, creating new melodies and harmonies on the spot. Jazz is also characterized by its rhythmic complexity, its use of syncopation and swing, and its distinctive blue notes. Jazz emerged from a blend of different musical traditions, including ragtime, blues, and European classical music.
And early jazz pioneers like Louis Armstrong, Duke.